know me, I generally can't hurt myself writing books, so that's a start. So I have a co-author on this book, Mark R. Moore, and we've written a couple of other books together, and people ask us why this book and why now, and part of it has to do with the fact that there's been a lot of cheating stories about baseball in the news, whether it's steroids or whether it's the sticky stuff on the baseball or whether it's the Houston Astros and the sign stealing, and all of them are very discreet. They come out and people talk about each one as if it's its own. And we're baseball historians, and so we wanted to look at sort of the context. What's the connections between these? What's interesting about this as a whole? What's interesting about cheating in baseball? What can we see there that you can't see if you just look at each of these discreetly? And the other thing that I would add is that our previous books have been on team building. What teams do to get ahead, and who are the original teams, and what things are they thinking of to get an advantage or strategic advantage on the other teams. And this is really a little bit of an extension of that, because this is where it's not just getting an advantage to get ahead of the other teams, but it's kind of going over the line. It's taking that advantage one step too far. So, you know, our book has 10 chapters, and we look at various types of cheating in each chapter. And essentially we have 6 themes that run through it. And I think it's more interesting, really, at least from a talk standpoint, rather than talk about different types of cheating, to really look at the themes that run through this book and then talk about some examples. So the first theme is that baseball and cheating have really been going on together forever. Baseball really became a popular sport in the 1850s when you had these New York club teams playing each other, the Brooklyn Excelsiors against the Unions that were on Manhattan, and as soon as you had teams starting to play each other where it started to matter, you have teams cheating in terms of trying to bring in ringers. That basically you're supposed to have a player on a team for 30 days before he could jump to another team, and that was violated all the time. Shortly thereafter, of course, at the time everybody was supposed to be an amateur player. It was not you weren't allowed to pay players, but of course, as soon as teams realized that they could get the better players by paying them under the table, they paid them under the table. And there's a guy named Joe Pinckney, for example, who was the first ringer, and another guy, for example, Jim Creighton, who's generally recognized as being the first professional. So this has been going on forever, and it's been going on with the players as well. You know, some of us, I play this, what's called vintage baseball, where we play by 1860s rules. And in vintage baseball, I see Howard here, Howard's playing, you have to pitch the ball underhand. And that was the way baseball had to be played in the 1860s. But of course, if you bring your arm up a little bit, you can make the ball move differently, you can throw it harder. So players started to bring their arm up. And interestingly, instead of penalizing the players, they basically changed the rule along. So in 1872, you could you could bring your arm up to your waist. Well, what did players start doing then? They just started pulling their pants up higher so they could get their arm up a little bit higher when that happened. You know, one of the other interesting things about sort of cheating being going on forever, it's everybody. It's players, it's managers, it's front offices, it's the owners, it's trainers, and it's groundskeepers. One of the more interesting groundskeeping stories is back in 1962, the Dodgers and the Giants were competing for the pennant, and they had a series in August where they were playing. So the Dodgers had a bunch of really good base stealers. Maury Wills, some of you guys might remember in 1962, he actually set the then record for most stolen bases in a season, Willie Davis. And so the groundskeeper's name was Matty Schwab. He, around first base, they dug up at night all the sand and dirt around first base, and they replaced it with peat and water and stuff so that you couldn't, the base stealers couldn't get any traction if they were going to try and run. Well, the Giants recognized this the next day, and they complained to the Dodgers recognized it the next day, and they complained to the umpires about this, and so they made them dig it up and put in the real stuff. But what the groundskeepers later told the press is they just put the same stuff back into the hole. And so there was actually only one stolen base in the game. It was the Giants catcher, Tom Haller, who stole a base. And you might want to say, well, how could somebody steal a base if they were starting all of this peat moss or whatever they stuck in there? Well, he stole third base. So the second theme is that competitive people will always seek an advantage, and sometimes they step over the line, which I was talking about a little bit earlier. And one of the things about that is that in many ways, professional baseball players, and I would say this is true of all sports and in a lot of walks of life, is that they don't look at it as a moral question. They look at it as a cost-benefit analysis. What's the value of it, and what can I get away with? What are the penalties if I get caught? And there was a guy named George Bamberger who was a manager of the Brewers for many years, manager of the Mets, and I'm just going to read this quote because I think he really said it well. He said, "We do not play baseball, we play professional baseball. Amateurs play games, we are paid to win games. There are rules and there are consequences if you break them. If you are a pro, then you often don't decide whether to cheat based on if it's right or wrong. You base it on whether or not you can get away with it and what the penalty might be. The guy who cheats in a friendly game of cards is a cheater. A pro who throws a spitball to support his family is a competitor." And that is sort of the way that a lot of players and people associated with baseball look at trying to win baseball games. And what happens is when the penalties don't match the benefits, that's where we end up with the kind of chaos and controversy that we get. And let me just give you a couple of examples. So throughout the 20th century, there was no formal rule against sign stealing with binoculars. Everybody thought it was cheating because you can tell that because no one ever admitted to doing it. And if it was talked about, the folks in baseball always said, gee, the league presidents would always say, you're not supposed to do that. But there was actually no rule against it. And one of the more interesting stories around this is a guy named Al Worthington, who was one of the few players who we might call honest. And it was basically for religious reasons. He felt that sign stealing was cheating, again, even though there was no rule against it. So he was on the San Francisco Giants in 1959, and he complained about it to his manager, Bill Rigney, who actually said, okay, we will stop sign stealing. And I actually ended up talking to Worthington, who's in his 90s now, who said that Rigney was a friend of his. Well, the next year he was on the Chicago White Sox, and the White Sox were sign stealing. Basically, in the late 50s, everybody was doing this. And so they were cheating, and the White Sox were competing for a pennant. And so Worthington went to manager Al Lopez, and here's what his manager, Al Lopez, said. "I told Worthington I couldn't tell him whether we were doing it or not. As a player, it was none of his business what we were doing, but I did say, show me in the rule book where it's wrong." Well, Worthington, to his credit, went to general manager Hank Greenberg, and Greenberg told him, "Baseball is a game where you get away with anything you can. You cut corners when you run the bases. If you trap the ball in the outfield, you swear you caught it. Everybody tries to cheat a little." And then he went, and he still got a no, and again, so now he goes to owner Bill Veeck, and some of you guys know Bill Veeck is sort of an iconoclastic owner, and in perfect Veeck-ese, Veeck says he told him, "Who do you think bought him the binoculars?" I tried to reason with him. I said, "Look, you cheat when you throw a curveball in a sense." Then I thought about his curveball and realized he didn't. So other places where we have cheating that, where cheating sort of leads to chaos because there's no rule in place is if there's just a rule that's not being enforced. And one of those would be sticky stuff on the baseball. So from 1944 to 1982, no player was ever thrown out of a game or suspended for throwing a ball with sticky stuff on it. And yet there was lots of controversies around it. It wasn't until more recently where people actually started to take this a little bit more seriously. And then another one I would say is steroids from the 1990s, where there was no way to detect it. Even though it was illegal to take steroids if you were a baseball player, because there was no testing, there was no way to detect steroids, and therefore we had this sort of chaos and controversy around steroids because we had no idea who took it, how many people took steroids, and so that is sort of one of these areas where we don't know. And I think that the general point here is if we don't have penalties that match the perceived benefits, we end up in these situations that cause controversies. And I think generally we're right now in baseball, there's not a whole lot of this, but that just remains to be seen what might come next. Another thing that sort of comes is that people who are at the forefront of innovation are also many times those who are at the forefront of going over the line. Branch Rickey, who was famous for inventing the farm system and famous for integrating baseball, when he signed Jackie Robinson, he invented the farm system in the sense that he took minor league teams and he made them part of his major league organization. But 10 years after creating the farm system, he was illegally controlling players. He was using the farm system to control players longer than he was technically allowed to under the baseball rules, and Commissioner Hernandez actually made a number of those, made 74 players free agents. And so here's someone who, you know, we admire through baseball history, and yet here he is cheating, and as one of these forefront of innovations, here he is cheating. And, you know, similar with Bill Veeck, who we just talked about, right? He was excited to use these binoculars. He did all kinds of stuff too with the grounds. I mean, Veeck was known for sort of doing all of these things, and yet he's also an innovator who did a lot of things to help his team win. And then the most recent example I would just give is Jeff Luhnow, who was the GM of the Houston Astros up to 2017 when they, up to 2019, but in 2017 they won the World Series, and they had the sign stealing scandal, and he was banned from baseball for a year and eventually fired. And yet, at the time they won the World Series, there was books being written about the Astros, about how this was the future of baseball and how these were the really the forward-thinking organizations. And then innovation. So innovations from outside of baseball were also something that people would try and figure out how to use in baseball. One example I like is modern Prism binoculars were first introduced in Germany in 1894, and by 1899 the Philadelphia Phillies had this sign stealing scandal where they were out in the center field bleachers using the binoculars to steal signs. PEDs, you know, steroids, obviously they came to baseball later than other sports because people thought that using weightlifting in baseball was not necessarily an advantage. But nevertheless, here's an innovation that came from outside of baseball, and someone thought that it worked in baseball. And then the last example I would just give is this. So no one really, I mean, the spitball was bad, and, you know, once in a while somebody would be fined for it, you know, in the late 1900s, or the late 1990s, 2000s. But it wasn't until more recently that people actually started cracking down on it. And they started cracking down on it due to two innovations that sort of came together at the same time. One was this spider tack, which is this substance that was invented for the world's strongest man competitions. I guess you have to carry these Atlas stones. I can't say I've ever tried it. So the people who were doing this invented this substance. They could hold these stones better. And the guys who invented it started saying we started getting all these orders from major league clubhouses, and we had no idea why we were getting these orders at the clubhouses. So you take that, and then we also have the introduction of this high-speed video and the high-tech radar, and so you can design pitches. You know, this isn't just Whitey Ford, you know, putting a little Vaseline on his hand and throwing it to Yogi Berra and say, where'd that ball go? This is, you know, people getting in labs with high-speed video and that can see exactly where their fingers are at the moment that they're releasing the ball, and they can see exactly what the ball's doing as it crosses the plate between the video and the radar. And so you have this completely different, really sort of intricacy and sophistication as to what was going on, and I think that's clearly what led to the more recent problems and why we had to have this crackdown, because it was a different level of sophistication around this cheating, and it really created a different ballgame. And so lastly, I would just say, you know, we talked a little bit about why has different cheating looked at differently, and how have things changed from the old days to today. Because if you look back at the old days, there was much more of this boys will be boys around cheating. There, you know, people weren't getting banned. People were saying it was bad, but no one was actually getting kicked out of baseball or suspended for doing anything. And, you know, a couple of things. One has to do with the deception of the umpire. I think that from the time the umpire was introduced in for baseball in the 1850s was essentially call your own, like you're playing pickup basketball and you get fouled and it's, you say you fouled somebody. Once the umpire was introduced, everybody put it, I was the umpire's job to catch you. It wasn't your job to say, you know what, that was a strike or that was a ball. And I mean, I think we've all learned that from, the time we started playing Little League baseball. I don't know that any of us have ever trapped a ball in the outfield and not held it up and said we caught it, or vice versa, said, no, I didn't catch that if the umpire called it out. And so I think that there's this idea around deception of the umpire, which has generally been said that's okay. And in the book, we try and have players, use their words to talk about it. So it's not just us. And there's a lot of players who talk about the fact that they view deception of the umpire as perfectly okay. Another example is guys who watch baseball a lot, is pitch framing by the catcher, where you try and make the ball look like a strike as you catch it, and the catchers say, well, I'm just trying to give the umpire a better look at the ball. But basically they're trying to get it called a strike. The other thing relative to drugs, I think there's the sense that we want to have a purity of on-field competition. There's this idea that we're looking at human limits sort of against human limits, and to the degree that we sort of don't do that on the field, that there's something wrong with that. And one of the stories I like to tell that we found in this book that we hadn't seen anywhere else is that the first drug scandal in baseball really occurred in 1951, when it turned out, it came out basically in a conversation between a sports writer and some players, that a guy named Hal Newhouser, who, for those of you who are baseball fans, was the MVP of the American League in 1945. He was a left-handed pitcher. He was for the Tigers. The Tigers won the World Series that year. He was taking Novocaine shots in his shoulder so that he could pitch. And it came out in 1951, and there was a very wide range of responses. Part of the response was, there was a headline in one of the papers like, Detroit dopes their way to world championship. And then there were other ones that were much more like, Newhouser gets Novocaine shot. And so the controversy died out relatively quickly, and I believe have died out, and you can sort of see this going forward, is that drugs that sort of brought you back to your natural ability were generally viewed as okay, right? And it's sort of that way today, whether it's people getting cortisone shots or Tommy John surgery where you have a tendon from your thigh or your wrist put into your elbow so you can keep pitching, that's okay, but performance-enhancing drugs that theoretically move you beyond your natural ability are not okay. And I think that consensus took quite a while, actually, to develop. And, throughout the 60s, people were debating, what was legal or what was fair and what wasn't. Another interesting thing has to do with roster manipulation. That's something that generally is treated very severely by the leagues, but it doesn't seem to be treated as severely in the press. So 2017, the Atlanta Braves GM, John Capalella, was banned for life from baseball for illegally signing players from Latin America, sort of going beyond the bonus rules. He would give agents a bunch of money and sort of tell them how to distribute the money, and so he was illegally overpaying for certain players beyond the rules, and he was banned for life. And this got very little press. I mean, the baseball obviously took this very seriously. They banned him for life, and yet, we don't. When the Braves won the World Series last year, that was hardly ever mentioned, and yet every time we talk about the Astros, we talk about whether or not they were sign stealing or not. And then I would just say a couple more things relative to cheating. One is sort of the intricacy and sophistication, which I already talked about. If you just put a little Vaseline on the ball, that sort of seems like it could be kind of cute, but when you start using spider tack and high-speed video, it feels different. The same way in sign stealing, having somebody, out in the outfield with binoculars trying to wave a red towel or a green towel feels a little different than having the video screen right by the dugout and having interns sort of using Apple Watches to communicate with the dugout. I mean, it feels a little different, and I think that's another thing that's changed. And then lastly, I would just say, did it work? If the Astros had lost in the division series, I don't think, we'd be talking about the Astros here 5 years later on their sign stealing scandal. I mean, they're still getting booed every time they go to a ballpark, even though there's very few players on the Astros that are still there from 5 years ago. So anyway, that is the book. Those are our 6 themes, and I appreciate everybody coming here tonight and happy to answer any questions. And please eat and drink. Who's this guy here?
I didn't understand your reference to the bases with base stealing. The players don't stand on the base when they're going to steal a base.
No, like the sand, the area around the base, the dirt around the base. They dug it up.
The players stand 3 or 4 feet from
Right,
the
so
base.
they took all the dirt around the base.
Like 3 or 4 feet out on
Yes, and they carted that away in wheelbarrows at night, and then they brought back peat moss, and they put lots of water down there, so you couldn't
just the base. But
No, the whole area around the base, all the area around first base.
So the big story in baseball right now is Aaron Judge going to break Roger Maris's record? And I read an article the other day that Roger Maris's son says that if Aaron Judge does it, it's the first legitimate breaking of the record. Do you agree with that?
No, I mean, I think, he's having fun, right? I mean, he still wants to, it's complicated. If people want to, we just try and sort of lay out sort of what the facts are in terms of what the rules are and what people were doing, and people can make their own judgment. My take is, until baseball decides to do some sort of NCAA kind of ruling where they invalidate records, the record's the record. And I think the problem with sort of the whole steroid thing to a certain degree is we have no idea who was guilty, right? I mean, from the 1990s and the early 2000s, before they had real testing, the only way we know certain people were guilty, or we know they were alleged to be guilty, because when they had the Mitchell report, when baseball engaged George Mitchell to do a study of who had been taking drugs in baseball, other than sort of going on getting the publicly available data, none of the players would talk, but they got a couple of trainers to talk who were sort of being charged with other things, and so the federal prosecutors made them talk to baseball, and so those people talked. So if those people were giving you steroids, then people knew or thought you were steroids, assuming those guys were telling the truth. But no one, we don't, there weren't those guys for every team. So I guess my take is, until we have a little bit more clarity about what was going on, I just think it's a big old mishmash, and the numbers are what they are. Greg.
Does the Pete Rose thing fit within the purview of your book, or is that a different issue?
So the question was about Pete Rose, and no, so to make this not a huge book, it's still too long, I suppose, but we basically said it was cheating to win. So we don't talk about Pete Rose, we don't talk about the Black Sox, we don't talk about the owners' collusion in the 80s when they wouldn't sign free agents, which obviously affected who was on what team. So no, it's purely cheating to win. Ed?
One of the nice touches you have in the book is taking quotations from certain players and then naming a rule after them. So early on in the book you have the Hornsby rule. And I thought that was a very good way of kind of, reinforcing your theme. So you might mention that kind of use in the book of those kind of quotations, and then saying, okay, we're going to call this the Hornsby rule or something else like that.
Yeah, so we tried to use player quotes to sort of state the themes as opposed to us just stating them. And so Hornsby was a all-time great second baseman for many years. He was a very ornery guy. He was in baseball for a long time after he retired as a coach and a manager and a scout. And he basically said, in my 50 years of baseball, there was not a game I played in that somebody didn't cheat. And more than that, if you didn't cheat, I don't want you on my team. And so we're using that to sort of state one of the themes. I talked about Keith Hernandez, who was a first baseman for the Mets and a very good player. He basically said, if it's okay, the spitball is okay because the pitcher's out there in front of 60,000 people and the umpire and the other team, and it's their job to catch them. It's not okay to cork a bat because you're doing that in the back room, and nobody can catch you. So we try and use those kind of quotations to highlight some of our things. Tony Gwynn, for example, who was a great outfielder for the Padres for a long time, he basically talked about drugs, saying essentially players always felt that amphetamines were okay, but steroids were cheating. And we talk a little bit about why there actually, we feel there is actually a difference between the two. And just as an aside, the reason that there is that players, and we talk about what we call a consensual ethic, which is kind of like unwritten rules, but without sort of the baggage when people talk about unwritten rules. And a consensual ethic is really what the people in the game feel. And most players felt that amphetamines were really a way to get through a 162-game season. That this season was so hard and so long and so grueling that sort of getting up for a game with amphetamines, that was just a way to get through the season. It was not sort of enhancing your natural ability. So we don't really have an opinion on that, but that was clearly what the players thought. Howard?
When you and Mark were researching the book, did you and Mark ever delve into the Gaylord Perry and the spitball controversy?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about Gaylord Perry and the spitball. So Gaylord Perry was just famous for throwing the spitball for many years. He wrote a book called Me and My Spitter. He came out later and said, I was just kidding. I don't really throw the spitter. I'm just doing that to try and make people think I am so that I get that psychological advantage. Two things. One is that between Nelson Potter in 1944 and Gaylord Perry in 1982, so essentially 40 years, nobody was ever thrown out of the game or fined or suspended for throwing a spitball. Gaylord Perry was the first, really in 40 years, and I think everyone assumes he got away with it a whole lot of times in between. But again, I think there was, a lot of people doing it, and people can sort of judge him. I mean, I don't think there's any question he was cheating. How you want to sort of judge that from a historical point of view and how you view his records is, personal, up to you. Mike?
I'm curious, with computers and analytics, the first people who started really going into the analytics, was that considered cheating when that first started to happen, or was that just an evolution that everybody eventually jumped on?
So the question about the analytics, no, it was pretty much an evolution that people jumped onto. One of the interesting stories about analytics is that the Cleveland Indians were actually the first team to have what I'll call this holistic database, where they had sort of everything about a player, medical records and data and scouting reports in one place. And sort of two things. Sort of 10 years later, one of the teams joked, that they would trade the guy Carlos Gonzalez, that they would have traded Carlos Gonzalez for that database. But the other thing just about the database is, and related to cheating, is that that one of the St. Louis Cardinals, their scouting director, hacked into the Houston Astros database to see who they wanted to draft, and and what they were willing to pay for draftees and all of that stuff. And the FBI got involved, and he was eventually sentenced to 46 months in prison. And I don't think it's going to happen again. You talk about penalties fitting the crime. I don't think people are going to be hacking into databases if they're going to get 46 months in prison. So pretty quickly, people realized there was a lot of, it created proprietary information. Before that, teams really didn't have proprietary information. You weren't going to break into somebody's office to steal their scouting cards on various players.
Yeah, question on prevalence. I mean, we always hear about the big guys who hit 65 home runs and they're juicing, but there's a guy who hit 6 home runs and there's the minors juicing. I mean, how do you feel, how prevalent is it? It isn't just among the superstars. Is everybody kind of doing it or has been doing it? Spitballs, Gaylord Perry, there are probably lots of guys throwing them that we don't even know who they are now. Is it something that only the elite players did or everybody did? They just weren't good enough to be noticed for their cheating?
I think for steroids in the 90s, I mean, the numbers have been anywhere from 10% to 50% as to how many people are doing it, and it's probably somewhere in between that. There's been a lot of retrospectives from minor leaguers have talked about, how they felt pressure to take steroids and they were never going to have a chance to make the major leagues. just as a complete aside, one thing that, baseball talks about the fact that they couldn't test players, and so it's not really, the commissioner's fault. It was just one of these things that happened, but they could have tested minor leaguers. The minor leaguers aren't protected by the union. In 1993, baseball banned smokeless tobacco in the minor leagues. And in fact, there were some teams that actually tested their minor leaguers for steroids and then sort of stopped just because it was more work than it was worth. So I don't know what the number was, but clearly it was probably fairly soon. I think spitball's a lot harder. I mean, if a manager thought, Billy Martin, when he was managing whatever team he was playing against, he would start complaining that pitcher was throwing a spitball. And the umpires would go out there and try and catch him throwing a spitball, and once in a while maybe they were, but usually they weren't. So I think there was fewer spitballs than people think. That was, people were really looking for that, and you could catch it. If, they would catch somebody going to their head for the Vaseline.
Like the Astros were stealing signs,
Yeah.
everyone knows, because they made it all the way. The Tigers might have been stealing signs any year, but they stopped.
Right.
So it's sort of like, how many teams do you think were stealing signs? A lot of them probably, right?
I don't think any of them were as sophisticated as the Astros, though. They clearly had, they had sort of these high-tech programs to, some stuff wasn't illegal, but they were deciphering the signs. So they had this program that their computer literate interns wrote, so that, when the sign was, multiple fingers pointing in different directions, that they could break the code, because you not only have to see the signal, you have to figure out what it is. And so they were able to do that. They had these interns, so I think they were more sophisticated. I think other teams were clearly trying to do it. Yes.
When I was a kid, there was another kind of cheating. I don't know if I'm remembering this right, but like sandpaper or something under the cap where the pitcher would go in like this and rough up his fingers. Did you ever run across that? Or?
Sure. A lot of times people would take sandpaper into their glove. If you guys haven't seen the YouTube video of Joe Niekro when he was on the Twins in 1987, you ought to look it up. It's pretty funny. But he was accused of using a nail file emery board nail file to mark up the ball, right, Jed? And the umpires all go out there, and you can see he's trying to pull it out of his pocket and throw it behind him. And the umpire sees him and picks it up, and he got suspended. And just to give you some sense, he got suspended for 10 games, but the next day he was on David Letterman wearing a tool belt. So you can see that, it was not, even though it was just a different view around that kind of cheating. Ed.
Let me give you another one. So a couple of days ago, everybody's watching Aaron Judge, and Aaron Judge got on first base, and a play at second base was what was reviewed as phantom tag at second base, and it seemed, from my vantage point watching the replay, that indeed the second base, the shortstop did not have the ball at the time to touch the bag. Do you think that because the phantom play at second base has long been something that, you would have encouraged, under the Hornsby rule, you would have encouraged the guy to do that if he could get away with it? You think that might have been an impact in why they didn't overturn that call?
I think if I didn't see that, but I think if they saw that he missed the bag, they would have called him safe.
Yeah, so he was called, the judge was called out on the field, and then they went and reviewed the play, and it seemed to the announcers as well as me that the shortstop never touched the bag, and so Judge should have been safe. And I wondered, having read your book, that that's one of those things where you kind of acknowledge, if you can get away with it, do it.
Right.
Because you got it out, and actually Judge would have scored a run, would have been important in the game in terms of the final outcome. So it seemed to me that maybe in light of that, it's like they didn't feel like they wanted to overturn that call, because that's kind of always acknowledged to have been a situation, hey, you get away with it, do it.
I I would be surprised if that was the case, because I think a lot of what's happened with, those plays are gone now with replay. The trap ball where you say you caught it, I mean, all of that is gone. I mean, players are coached to do that. So, you know, Gil Hodges was recently in the Hall of Fame, talked about, I mean, how he coached Ed Kranepool, who's another first baseman, and Kranepool's on the Mets, to pull your foot off the first base a split second before the ball got there, so you had a split second extra to get the runner. So players were coached to do this, but if you're caught with that now, I think they're going to call you. I mean, I think all that's gone. So I'd be surprised. I think they probably just didn't see it the same way you did. But just one other recent story like that, because one of the things we talk about, like, you think about the old days and you hear these stories about guys like John McGraw, was a great manager and played for the Orioles, hiding balls in the grass, you know, and then grabbing an extra ball. And you think, oh, these are just sort of, you know, tall tales. But in 2018, the third baseman for the Mets, Todd Frazier, was going to catch a foul ball. And some of you guys, again, this is YouTubeable. It's just a funny play. So he reaches into the stands to catch a ball, and he comes up holding a ball, and the umpire calls him out. But when they showed it on replay, it turned out that he picked up a kid's ball. That he didn't catch it. They picked up a kid's ball off of the chair next to him and held it up, and then he flipped it back to the kid, and he got the outcome. So, you know, this is, you know, right?
Do you ever see an instance where, somebody that wins the World Series, if a large cheating scandal was uncovered, and they take that World Series away from them?
Well, the answer is no. There's never been really a large cheating scandal until the Astros, you know, in 2017, which came out then in 2019. You know, I think there was a lot of people. I could say a lot. There was a significant, you know, small group of people that said we should take the championship away, but I don't think baseball's ever really thought about doing that. So I'd be, I mean, it would have to be I don't even know what it would be. It'd have to be something really egregious. Maybe if you used players that weren't on your roster and somehow you use fake. It would have to be something sort of that kind of cheating. I think on-field. I don't think it would happen for on-field cheating. I think it would have to be some sort of illegal roster kind of moves. Well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. Appreciate everybody.